London, June 1806. The French army has raised the imperial eagle over Westminster. Napoleon has conquered London. The British government evacuated the city after the Battle of Dartford, and were now located in the English Midlands. With much of the British chain of command in disarray, Arthur Wellesley became the de facto leader of the survivors of the Battle of Dartford. He attempted to escape to the Midlands with thousands of British troops. Napoleon sent Marshal Davout to capture Wellesley, while the remainder of the Grandee Armee worked to pacify southern England. However, Davout encountered resistance to a scale that the French had never seen before. Militia groups harassed the French on every road, dealing the invaders significant casualties in skirmish after skirmish. Davout and the French Third Corps had little ability to retaliate, since they had scant knowledge in where the militias were organizing or keeping their weapons. They were marching into England blind. Furthermore, whenever the French tried to forage the countryside for supplies, the militias would burn forests, farms, and seize any civilian supplies they found, denying the French access to them. Eventually, the Third Corps began to starve, and Davout began to lose hundreds of men to attrition. Wellesley even managed to establish communications with the local militias, and began coordinating larger and larger ambushes against the French. Davout feared that he was heading into a disaster. He decided to retreat back to London. Wellesley and the militias continued to harass Davout on his way there. By the time Davout returned to London, thousands of French soldiers had been lost. In other parts of England, the French army was facing a similar dire situation. It was extremely dangerous for French soldiers to move around the English countryside, as guerrilla warfare attacks were common. Furthermore, the French had no luck gathering supplies in England, as the British resistance militias burned or seized all food, guns, and clothing before the French could have them. Napoleon was forced to use Villeneuve and Gravina's massive fleets to carry supplies from the continent to England. This was the only way he was able to sustain the Grandee Armee in England. The conquest of Britain would take far longer than Napoleon initially planned. Since the French and Spanish fleet were busy carrying supplies across the English Channel, the British were able to maintain naval superiority in the Irish Sea. Parliament eventually reconvened in Birmingham, where the remainders of Prime Minister Pitt's government were now based. Prime Minister Pitt had died en route to Birmingham, leaving the British government without a leader. Parliament gathered to elect a new Prime Minister. At the same time, a letter arrived from Napoleon, which was read aloud to the Parliament at Birmingham. Napoleon declared that southern England was firmly under his control, and that it would only be a matter of time before his armies reached Birmingham. The Emperor offered to negotiate an end to the war with the British, promising a favorable peace treaty. A small group of anti-war MPs, who feared that war would ruin the United Kingdom, wanted to accept Napoleon's offer. However, one of Pitt's supporters, George Canning, gave a rousing speech before Parliament where he spoke of how Arthur Wellesley and the survivors of Dartford had forced the French to retreat. Canning declared that this war was winnable, and that Napoleon had fallen into a bear trap by daring to invade the soil of Britain, further calling Pitt a martyr for the British cause against Napoleon. Roused by this speech, Parliament began clamoring to fight France to the bitter end. They easily elected another one of Pitt's supporters, the Duke of Portland, to become the Prime Minister. Portland was seen as a compromise candidate between rival factions of Pitt's supporters to serve as the figurehead leader of the government. Portland made Canning his foreign secretary. Canning was determined to use every possible resource available to him to drive out Napoleon. Most significantly, he ordered half of the British regulars in Ireland, a total of 9,000 men, to cross the Irish Sea and reinforce British positions in the English Midlands. Under Portland's government, a man named Charles Lennox, the Duke of Richmond, served as a Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Canning gave broad authority to Richmond to brutally suppress the growing discontent in Ireland. Rumors were abound in Ireland that James Hope, one of the last surviving leaders of the previous two Irish revolts, was organizing militias across Ireland in preparation for another rebellion against British rule. The Duke of Richmond sent regulars into the Irish countryside to root out militia cells that were believed to be linked to Hope. In addition, Richmond ordered the arrest of the outspoken Irish leader Henry Grattan, who was famous for his advocacy for Irish freedom and self-rule. All this caused massive riots to erupt across Ireland, especially in the city of Dublin. Eventually, news of this reached Napoleon. Admiral Gravina informed Napoleon that he had been contacted by James Hope. If Napoleon could spare a few ships to send weapons into Ireland, Hope promised to stage a gigantic rebellion against the British. Napoleon signed off on the plan, hoping to increase pressure on the British to come to the negotiating table. By late August 1806, Gravina crossed the Celtic Sea and landed on the shores of southern Ireland, distributing weapons among James Hope's militias. James Hope was one of the senior leaders of the last Irish Revolt, which saw many of his friends and allies in the Society of the United Irishmen killed or captured. But Hope had managed to evade British authorities for years. He had built up a large network of Irish militias in preparation for the Third Irish Revolt. Now, it was time for Hope's revenge. Hope's forces managed to swiftly overwhelm the British garrison at Dublin. Richmond and some of his soldiers fled the city, taking a ship to Northern Ireland. Hope freed Henry Grattan, and the two worked together to draft the constitution for the new Irish Republic. Grattan proudly proclaimed the establishment of an independent Irish Parliament. By the end of September, Hope's forces had liberated a significant portion of Ireland, and fighting had spread all across the island. All of this convinced Napoleon that he could win the war in one grand, final offensive. His army had been stashing supplies for the past 2 months in preparation for an expedition into the English Midlands. Napoleon's plan was to move slowly, but overwhelmingly, towards Birmingham. He ordered Admiral Villeneuve to eliminate the British naval presence in the Irish Sea, seeking to isolate British forces on Ireland and Britain. However, soon after Napoleon's forces began their march to Birmingham, terrible news arrived from Europe. The Kingdom of Prussia, presumably seeking to take advantage of France's distraction in the British Isles, had declared war against the French Empire. Prussian troops now marched against French allies in Germany. The War of the Fourth Coalition had just begun.